From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. Among the perennial questions that preoccupy students of the American South is a deceptively simple one. What is the American South? How best to define it? Can we reliably think of the South as simply a geographic region? The southern states that embraced slavery, cotton production, the former Confederacy? Or is the South not simply a place but an idea, an amalgam of culture, habits, ways of thinking and behaving? Historians especially wrestle with this question, and in recent years have started to examine other additional ways to think about the South, what makes it up, and how to conceptualize it. Scholars of the global South have been especially helpful in this regard, and today we are joined by one such expert to help us think more deeply about what makes up the American South. Our guest today is Professor Matt Childs, who teaches in the History Department at the University of South Carolina. Matt teaches graduate and undergraduate courses dealing with Latin American and Caribbean history, Atlantic history, and comparative histories of colonialism and slavery in shaping the modern world. He is the author of the 1812 Aponte Rebellion in Cuba and the Struggle against Atlantic Slavery, which was a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. He has also edited several books, has received research grants from the Social Science Research Council, the Ford Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies, among others. He is currently working on a book-length monograph that places the historical experiences of Cuba's population of African descent in the wider Atlantic world context. Matt, welcome to Take on the South.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Our pleasure. So I hope to learn a lot from you today, and I usually do anyway when we chat. But before we get into the specifics of what is the global South and how that might help historians of the American South better understand their region, can you just tell us a bit more about your work, what you do, and why you do it?
Yeah, sure. So I'm kind of a historian I like to think of the Americas in a way. Mm-hmm. I have my home base, as you kind of indicated, is Latin America and the Caribbean, with focus on the African diaspora and kind of the legacies of slavery over several centuries, and even the way we're continuing to deal with it. I've been fortunate in my sort of academic training that I don't have to be so tied to a geographic location. Yeah. So I often think that I study people more than I do places, and I try to follow people when they come in and out of kind of traditional historical frameworks, whether it is a nation or whether it is an empire, and then we kind of begin to see connections from that. So above all, I'm interested in how convergences of historical processes come together at a certain place and then kind of tie the world together. Mm.
Yeah, that's going to be quite the challenge, really, because, I mean, if you focus on, say, English history or Spanish history, then you have a kind of narrative already set up for you, don't you, in a national context. But here you are looking at people's migration, interchanges. What kind of demands does that make on you as an historian?
The biggest one is just being eclectic in sources and taking advantage of other places to go. And how far can you kind of follow them in and out of your frame of analysis for it?
Is this part, Matt, of the turn towards Atlantic history?
Yeah. I mean, it's part of a turn towards Atlantic history where we see the convergence of these four continents and the legacies it left. We see more kind of similarities than differences. And so this is where I think the biggest advantage is for Southern historians. The South inevitably is pivoted as a foil to the North. And if it's always pivoted towards the North, in the U.S. context, it has this defensive position, and it's kind of a history that has to implicitly answer to the North. Mm-hmm. But when we look at kind of broad convergences of people, empires, products, we begin to see far more similarities. And even as somebody who's now lived in the South for 20 plus years, I actually think the South is far more like Latin America than it is in the North and Midwest where I grew up. And its customs, its way of people interacting, like my son is graduating from high school, and just the way parents even interact with each other, it is far more familiar to me than the time I spent in Latin America from what I grew up with in Michigan.
That's really interesting. Let's linger on that for just a bit. So what you're saying is that your experience as a non-Southerner who's now lived for 2 decades in the American South in South Carolina reminds you more of Latin America than it does of any other part of the United States.
Yeah, and kind of every way. And this just isn't because of the recent immigration of Latinos into the South and explosion, what we can call the Nuevo South. It is kind of these cultural customs that come out of centuries of kind of ways of being.
So can you give a few examples of that?
Yeah, kind of on a everyday level.
Yeah.
So, the South loves barbecue. It's probably its biggest kind of component to the national cuisine of the U.S.
Right.
And even when you travel out of the U.S., what is one of the ways that you kind of define the South through its food? Barbecue. You can find barbecue now everywhere. It's a global product.
Yeah.
Well, pork is also the most dominant kind of meat that's in parts of the Caribbean diet and most Latin American diets. And those first pigs that were even brought here to South Carolina were brought by the Spanish.
Yeah.
And so even where there is a large Latino population, like when I lived in Texas for 6 years where I met my wife, pork is important, but it's all cow.
Yeah.
It's cattle. Right. And so that sort of, even the food customs are very similar and convergent in that way.
That's interesting.
And even like the way people, like I really like spicy food, right? Mm-hmm. Today is Cinco de Mayo, right? Which has not only a food connection to the South and kind of having some spicy, but even how the South influenced how Cinco de Mayo is celebrated. So Cinco de Mayo, as many of your kind of listeners know, this is the famous Battle of Puebla in 1862, when the French are actually involved in occupying Mexico. So because of the U.S. Civil War as a global war, the French see this as an opportunity to move into Mexico and occupy the territory. Without the Civil War going on, the French would not have had this kind of easy entry, and they would have been more respectful of what at that time was the Monroe Doctrine. But since all the politics was drawn internal, right, we do see the Civil War as this one moment where most defines the South. It's one where really kind of the legacies of how the South has to define itself afterwards come out. But that one event influences how kind of what plays out in Mexican nationalism for the next 150 years.
So you're making a very persuasive case that we have to look outside in order to understand the inside, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And the pork thing's interesting too. Everybody who studies the Old South, they're sort of cotton obsessed, right? So it's all about cotton, and it was obviously. But if I remember correctly, the cotton crop, the value of the cotton crop in the entire South in 1860 was less than the value of the pig crop, if you will, in the same year. It was a huge thing, and it still is. You're entirely right. Interesting. Okay, so food, that's one thing. Slavery surely has to have so one of these things that knits the South into that global South? Yeah,
so slavery, of course, and racial relations is the biggest one, the most obvious one. And when we think of like the South's relationship to slavery, especially in the 19th century, which then leads up to the Civil War, slavery is expanding in the U.S., it's expanding in Cuba, and it's expanding in Brazil. And in all three areas, it's expanding very dramatically and geographically. So in the South, it's essentially moving from the Atlantic seaboard into what becomes known as the Cotton Belt. And when the 18th century started, nobody would have predicted how far that would have expanded, how much the slave population would have grown from 1 million to 4 million. And then, so there isn't this sense of inevitability of abolition or slavery is really on its demise. In fact, it ends up reaching its kind of the strongest point as economic, political, and cultural system up until the 1860s. And that's also true for Brazil and Cuba.
Okay, so people often don't think that, do they? You're entirely right. And I'm really glad that you're reminding us of, we tend to read history backwards. Oh, wait, because slavery ended, therefore it was in a state of demise. But in many ways, it was vibrant.
Yes, the largest slave population of enslaved Africans in the Americas reached its height in 1860.
Interesting, yeah.
So the U.S. South, almost 4 million again.
Yeah.
Brazil, 1.5, and then Cuba and Puerto Rico, another 750,000. Mm-hmm. And so there was nothing inevitable about it. And the other thing, too, is like the way slavery ends. Such a system ingrained so much into the political and cultural systems of all these states. In each area, it ended in some way through warfare. Mm-hmm. So in the U.S., it did take this transformation during the course of the war from Lincoln, like the first part of the war, at least the way I read it, it's a war of secession.
Right.
It's a war to preserve slavery. Mm. And then Lincoln comes around to now it has to be a war to end slavery, and he goes through his own transformation. And, scholars far more talented than I have written about that, like Vernon Burton or Eric Foner, and really that transformation. Cuba also has a similar sort of transformation that it goes through warfare. Slavery in Cuba will last until 1886. Cuba fights its kind of first war for independence in 1868. And when the war starts, it's not clear that it's going to be a war of abolition, a war of voluntarily kind of manumitting, kind of to show your kind of pursuit of freedom, or how it will be drawn out. And that goes on for 10 years. But through that warfare, where slaves are running away to join the fight, they're kind of corroding their chains from within. Mm-hmm. And after that 10 years, slavery really cannot bounce back. Mm-hmm. And then Brazil gets into a border war with Paraguay, and they need to enlist soldiers to fight. So one of the ways to demonstrate your kind of commitment to the nation and defending its territorial integrity is to emancipate your slaves by having them participate in the war.
When was that war, by the way?
So it starts in 1868,
okay,
and it goes, well, I might have that date wrong, but it goes for 3 or 4 years. And so when those wars start, like the protagonists and the antagonists were fighting for abolition. These are all opportunities for them.
And it's a very healthy reminder that lots of these things are vaguely coterminous, right? Yeah. I mean, they're happening in the second half of the 19th century. Right?
Yeah. And they become interlinked. So this is where, I like to stress the convergences. So, for example, in the U.S., the transatlantic slave trade to U.S. territories ends in 1808. It does not ban, though, American slave traders from continuing to participate in the slave trade. Right. So they basically changed destinations from U.S. ports, like Charleston, et cetera, to Cuba and Brazil. And U.S. slave traders end up transporting across the Atlantic 2.5 times as many slaves in the entire history of the U.S. trade. So in the U.S. trade from Africa to the U.S., roughly 400,000 slaves were brought in. But if you take the collective effort of U.S. slave traders, they imported over 1 million into Brazil and Cuba after abolition in the U.S.
After 1808.
Yeah.
Right. After the, so historians love this date, don't they? 1808, the slave trade stops. Well, it does if you take just a hyper-regional focus. And what you're saying is, if you look at this as a global South question, that explains in part the significant growth in the enslaved population in the American South. Yeah. You can't look just at the South, in other words.
Yeah, and even for the rapid expansion of what becomes a cotton belt is tied up by looking at events elsewhere. Yeah. So the Haitian Revolution, abolishes slavery in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, that then becomes Haiti. 400,000 slaves are freed. So Napoleon has a plan that he wants to restore slavery in the Caribbean, and he sends the largest fleet across the Atlantic in 1802. That ends miserably, and out of that, the nation of Haiti is born. So the repercussions for the U.S. is all of a sudden Napoleon is interested in selling what becomes the Louisiana Purchase. And Jefferson is very eager to get a hold of Louisiana for trade coming down the Mississippi. When he sends his emissaries and they're talking, they just pretty much want to get a hold of the port. And they're surprised that Napoleon wants to give up this entire territory. So the destruction of slavery in Saint-Domingue allows for its expansion into what becomes a cotton belt in the South, right? And those two become so intimately linked.
Yeah.
And in other ways is by the people themselves. So first, people flee the revolution in Saint Domingue, also known as the Haitian Revolution, and they go to nearby Cuba, where they're welcomed with open arms. Essentially, here's emigres. They're bringing their slaves with them. They're in Cuba, and they establish themselves in Havana, in the city in the eastern part of the island, Santiago. But then, in 1808, Napoleon changes his designs and dimensions from kind of expanding the French Empire outwards to really concentrating on Europe. He invades Spain, occupies Spain, puts his brother on the throne. So now the French that went into exile into places like Cuba are kicked out. And when they're kicked out of Havana and Cuba, they end up in Louisiana. In 1810, the size of New Orleans is doubled. Its entire population is doubled in New Orleans by the arrival of all these emigres that come with them and bring their slaves.
There was some significant refugee presence in Charleston.
Yeah. In Charleston, in fact, some of the earliest refugees that came from the Haitian Revolution are showing up in 1791, 1792, 1793. They're covered in the Charleston papers. Yeah. They're at the St. Mary's Church in Charleston, where they're receiving aid. And this actually really does begin to alarm kind of what's going on in the South. Right. And even there's these kind of informal fact-finding missions that are leaving and going back. Could this really have happened? Could the slaves really kind of created this army? Did they win this? And so there's just like, oh my gosh, there's something we have to do.
And do we want it here?
Yeah.
Right? Hence Denmark Vesey.
Yeah.
Right. Or at least the rumor, the plot, right?
Yeah. At least the rumor and the plot. Yeah. And then even like the Haitian Revolution in the imaginary.
Yeah.
And both of Southerners, right, who are slaveholders, and then the slaves themselves. And so they're both appropriating this kind of transformations that are happening to strategize about how to either extend or demise slavery.
So this is a really good illustration of your fundamental point that if you study the people, you're going to have a much better understanding of how these things knit and interact. And if you just study the region as a geographic construct, you're going to miss a lot of this, right? It's also true, isn't it, that after the Civil War in the United States, there was some effort on the part of Southern planters to move to Brazil to recreate slavery, or at least Southern slavery in the global South?
Yeah. For some Southerners, right, they cannot imagine themselves living in a world that does not have slavery. And so they do migrate to Cuba, to Puerto Rico, but most notably to Brazil.
Do you know how many went to Cuba, Matt? I'm curious. I didn't realize that.
So over 1,000.
That's quite a lot.
And they already had ties with Cuba because of its proximity. So, for example, even like we have the papers at the Caroliniana of John G. Waterman. He was a physician who worked on slave plantations, and he was also contracted out to go to Cuba. And he has this great account of his life in Cuba in 1844 when he's there.
So because slavery is not formally abolished in Brazil and Cuba until the 1880s, the South, or at least these former Southern planters, kind of have a couple of decades to recreate Southern slavery in the global South, right?
At least, from their perspective, it is. And there is this group that it definitely makes to kind of the U.S. and the press in Europe of Confederados in Brazil. They have a Confederate Day and how they kind of meet and congregate.
Do they still do that?
Yeah, they still do that. And so in some ways it becomes this kind of identifier of both family lineage, kind of their identity as, they wouldn't really use the term Brazilian Americans, but they are clinging on to that.
Okay, hang on a minute. So they still, Brazil has a Confederate Day.
That's organized by kind of these civic societies and associations.
Okay, but not a state-sponsored one.
Right, correct.
Okay, well, all right, thank you. Because that would be quite curious. But nonetheless, they do celebrate it, right?
Yeah.
After their move from the South to Brazil.
Yeah. And so even the way they imagine kind of what the South is, it's not restricted to kind of the territory of the U.S. So there's a South in the imaginary that has its cultural components, which they want to be a part of, and can they recreate it somewhere else?
I suspect that lots of people listening to this conversation are going to say, well, that's really interesting and new. I've never thought of it that way. You've been doing this for a long time, though. Can you give people a sense of when historians really started to take this framework for understanding the South as part of a global South seriously? Where did it come from, Matt? And who are some of the main originators of it?
Yeah, I mean, there's early scholars who were interested in this, like even Phillips. His first chapter in his book is about on the West Indies as a plantation model for it. But recently what has really come about is area studies. Used to be like we sealed these off from each other and you kind of just directed your scholarship internal towards that. Coming out of the 1990s, things began to see far more global. We understand the world now is global. So a lot of this is also placing when did globalization begin? And here, what we can call the global South is far more at the forefront of those sort of developments and connecting the world. And so scholars have been more and more increasingly pursuing that.
I mean, it's kind of head scratching though, isn't it? Because, maybe this is just a commentary on the sluggish nature of scholarship to catch up with a reality. But from its very inception, you cannot reliably talk about the founding of, say, South Carolina without keen attention to this at least Atlantic world and arguably a global world. Right?
Yeah. Exactly. So, of course, South Carolina, is basically at least it's an idea to be founded as a second Barbados.
Yeah.
So from the very beginning, the Lords Proprietor that come, that's their conception. That's the way they're raising money for it. And so it's there.
In other words, it's always been that.
Yes,
right?
It's always been there, right?
But
so the biggest tension for historians is history is a discipline that first and foremost is usually in service of the nation. And it's either in service of the nation to create myths about the past, ground them in kind of documentation, or it's also a way that is to contest the past. And that's why history is always at the forefront in these battles over how the nation is defined. And so this is where I really think the great benefit of looking at the South in a global phenomenon. Then it's not just defined versus the North. And you can kind of begin to see different ways to define the South and its commonalities. And for me, at least, just my historical philosophy, it's far better to draw out similarities and convergences than divergences and differences, because that's what people then cling on to be so tied to how they define themselves. And then at some point, if we're not looking for enough convergences and similarities, it's not really about history anymore. It's defending something in the past, right, which puts it on this polemical table that people want to carve up and take their own versus kind of debating it as a historical topic. So, for example, a couple, contentious topics right now, I won't get into all the ones in the U.S. that are there, but that's essentially, it's not really debating the historical facts. It's debating the historical narrative and lessons that people want to take from it. Right?
So, again, you're a professional historian and you understand the function that history serves at the time that it serves. In other words, and as you just rightly pointed out, history can serve to bolster the idea of a nation, right? And if I hear you correctly, a lot of these areas studies treating the South as the South or the history of the United States, they're legitimate histories, but they're doing some quiet labor in which they're reinscribing the idea of an America, of a South. And what you're saying is that if you step back, you're not just getting a more accurate history with the global South, but you're countering the ideology of the idea of a nation, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But what about the flip side, though, Matt? You could say, and I'm not making an argument here, but I'm just sort of feeling it out, that the preeminent ideology at the moment, or at least one that's going to become even more important, is the idea of globalism. What stops your work from becoming hostage to that ideology?
Yeah, so very good point. And so globalism, the way I think about it, did the people define themselves either explicitly or implicitly as being kind of globally connected?
Yeah.
And that tends to be kind of the guiding force, because there's numerous times when, the nation is really where it's at, what should be studied, and how it's defined.
So it matters what people think, right? Which is ironic because we started this conversation with you saying to me, I feel as though I'm in the South and with a definite identity. Of course, it's connected in your mind and accurately so to Latin America. I guess people can hold two positions simultaneously, right? They can be part of a nation state, but also a kind of global citizen, right? Do you hear a lot of that in your sources?
Yes. I mean, and the way it comes out. So, for example, a lot of the work that I read is either in Spanish, but a lot of the enslaved population, that's not their primary language. And even in court documents, they would have to bring in translators for them. Right? Usually that is not in kind of the original African language they were spoken. It provides it in a summary. But even at that moment, like, oh, here's this person in this legal case. And it shows that even the way they're kind of processing is through another script.
So you're heavily invested in this, and I know you're at the forefront of this kind of endeavor. Indulge me for just a second, though. This idea of Atlantic history, global South, why can't comparative history do the labor of that? Is it because comparative history keeps in place the idea of nations? Is that part of the problem?
No, not necessarily, right? Because nations have the problem with comparative history is that one is always a foil.
Yeah, and
so you're defining it against something, usually to take away kind of a lesson for it.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, it seems the Civil War is inevitable because of the way slavery is expanding versus quote unquote an industrial North. And then it kind of puts us on this path, and it takes all the way until 1860 to get there.
Right.
So to compare that way. But if we take the South as a region and compare it again to Brazil or Cuba, there's nothing inevitable about what's coming. In fact, it seems like nothing is in danger. And so I think the benefit of kind of turn to Atlantic history, global history, is the pivot to which historians can do and not get so wrapped up in kind of these teleological analyses where you have a clear origin and destination of the kind of narrative that you want to tell.
Is anybody doing comparative history any longer?
Yeah. I mean, there's great books out there. Right? Enrico Ilago, like, and here's an example of kind of South. He looked at kind of the agrarian economy of Italy. And so Italy actually has a very similar both kind of historical experience, economic experience to the U.S. in terms of its North and South, and then the way the South in Italy has defined it. So, for example, like when people think about Italy and its intellectual and great history, they look at Florence, Venice, the industrial North, Milan, and its agricultural South, right, of peasants in places like Naples. And so even there's these kind of very similar kind of popular cultural references to the north of Italy, to the south, that map exactly onto what happens here in the United States. And here's a funny example of one. Like, I'm sure many people listening know the famous HBO series The Sopranos that really kicked off this great series, or what now is driving almost all television, Netflix, Amazon Prime production, right? Very successful. So anyway, it's about this, most of your listeners will know, but just really briefly, it's about this crime family in New Jersey. They are Italian Americans. They identify with their Italian American ancestry. So in one of the episodes, there's going to be protests at a Columbus statue, and Tony and his mob crew want to go down there and rough up the protesters. Okay? Well, in Tony's crew that he has that is still connected to Italy is one of his enforcers who has a great name, Furio. And Furio, they're there talking about Columbus. They're debating Columbus, just sitting outside their meat shop, drinking espressos. And they ask if you're, hey, you're from Italy. What do you think about Columbus? He says, well, I'm from the South, and he was from Genoa, and the North always talked down about us, so I don't like Columbus at all. And this whole crew gets upset about this. What are you talking about? Columbus is a hero of America and everything. So even there, right, they're having the exact same debate that we're having now about kind of what sort of is the historical legacies can we appropriate for. And in Columbus, whether it's Columbus or, however, certain people, because they become such polemical symbols of a nation, of an identity, they get beyond history. Yeah. And it's hard for us to study them. And so that's one of the things that does concern me, in particular about the U.S. Are our founding fathers like untouchable anymore? Mm-hmm. Because they become these lightning rods. And that's why I like the comparative perspective that brings it in. Because these issues are debated, discussed, whether it's in Britain, whether it's in former British colonies, whether it's in Spain or in its Latin American colonies, Brazil or Portugal. But it doesn't have the same sort of high degree of politicalization that's happening in the U.S. and how the past has become such a wedge issue. So again, part of the reason why I like looking at it comparatively, and usually like when I'm talking informally, people, they react in two ways. Like, oh, I didn't even know they had slavery for that long in other countries. And some are like, oh my gosh, this is part of a global system. But then others also kind of take comfort in it. So, I guess the U.S. wasn't so bad then, right? And then so that has to be kind of explained and contextualized. Yeah.
This is the value of what you do, right? I mean, this is your kind of professional obligation to put the present in some kind of context, which always comes from the past. Let me sort of conclude with a long arc here. Can you tell us what some of the most exciting work in your field is? What's going on? What are the new directions? I mean, are people still within the Atlantic paradigm, or is it shifting to something else? Where are you headed in your field?
Well, at least from kind of my somewhat narrow field of kind of the African diaspora, one of the great things that has happened, there's been a really huge explosion in the historical writing on Africa prior to the 20th century. Once Africa got its independence in the 1960s, most of the history was about that struggle. So now there is this large base of literature on pre-colonial African history. And now for historians, whether they're in the South, whether they're in the Caribbean, where I'm based in Brazil, can really tap into this literature. And really, we know far more about the enslaved who arrived in the Americas. There's a massive transatlantic slave trade database that records over 35,000 voyages. We can even, to a certain point, we can even get beyond generic terms like Africans and enslaved, and we can refer to, with far greater specificity, kind of migration streams, culture, customs, and belief systems that they came with. So like for here in South Carolina, that you've written about in others, once we place kind of an event like the Stonewall Rebellion in 1739 within the context of what was going on in the Kingdom of Congo and the Portuguese colony of Angola, we really have an entirely different sort of interpretation of it. Yes, first and foremost, resistance to enslavement, being denied freedom, but the way they expressed what they wanted out of that rebellion by marching with a banner of, the Virgin Mary on it, really tells us something.
Yeah, I think it does. And of course, I'm a bit biased because I've been working on that, as you say. Some of this sounds like it's heavy data, right? I mean, there's a lot of computing and mining going on here. Is that accurate?
So there's two fields.
Okay.
So one is definitely the statistical database that started. I mean, the first time I used it was on a CD-ROM. And for it in the 90s, and now it's open source. Yeah. And so the one thing that's happening, like that provides the context for historians. Who were they? Where'd they come? How specific can we get in drawing it? And then it's usually through ethnographic sources that people kind of get into these brief descriptions. It is a lot of conjecture, right? So there is this kind of sense of we know how many people came. We don't have like internal thoughts, reflective thoughts of the enslaved until they do get in some sort of rebellion. Right. So there is this sort of like if they came from this area, this would be likely. So this work, because of that nature, I think will always be refined and debated to a certain degree.
Makes perfect sense.
But the thing I do like about it, though, history, as a discipline, is always struggling between its social science origin, data, analysis, evidence, footnotes. I can empirically show this, versus a narrative and kind of the moral lesson. And that's where it's in the humanities. And since history constantly has to straddle that, the historian has to wear essentially two hats.
Yeah, and most historians manage to pull off just one of them, right? Yeah. Which is why there is this interesting, not split necessarily, but emphasis. So there are two kinds of books that historians write. One is very popular, and the one is read by 200 people, right? And you've got to marry that at some point, and that's part of the challenge. But I do think that your particular field has been quite good at that. So the idea of Atlantic history is quite an accessible idea because some of those historians have written in a very accessible fashion. Yeah,
and it's also a way for like areas that we tend to think are marginal to national narratives can become central in some ways.
Yeah.
So a place like St. Augustine, Florida, that's on the northern frontier of the Spanish Empire, garrison city, but the convergence of people either fleeing to St. Augustine, people going to St. Augustine, this border, it's really far more cosmopolitan than places like where we tend to define that would be. And this is also where, Charleston will always be prominent because it's so important in the culture, not only of the state, but of the nation. But it's far more global at an earlier age than places like New York and Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Even though those cities and others like them tend to get a higher kind of elevation in, what was the kind of defining thoughts, actions, and people of the nation.
Yeah, so what you're really doing here is richly and accurately texturing the past, right? So as you say, for example, if you said to somebody today, what was the more cosmopolitan city, Charleston or New York in the colonial period, most people would say New York, when the actual fact is it was Charleston, right?
And even by its cultural institutions.
Yeah.
Its libraries, its opera, cultural performances, the people who traveled there. Yeah. And then, like in my own work, I've even argued that in many ways, the enslaved population is far more cosmopolitan than their masters. If we take cosmopolitan by kind of an 18th and 19th century definition, which is one, people not rooted in a specific place, but are kind of combining multiple cultures.
Yeah.
And they're multilingual, even though we don't have access to all their African languages. They've traveled across the Atlantic. They're bringing culture and food customs with them.
That's right.
In a way.
Yeah, that's really clever. I like that a great deal. Matt, any concluding thoughts you'd like to leave listeners with? In other words, you have to study the global South because
you can only understand it. You can only understand the South by looking at other places, and it elevates overall the importance of the South, right? So the South was definitely, it had a history independent of being defined by the North. For it. Yeah.
All right. I think that's about as strong as a conclusion as I can hope for. Professor Matt Childs, thanks so much for being on Take on the South.
Sure. Glad to be here.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.